All right, so today we're going to try and wrap our heads around something pretty wild, something called hyperintentionality. It's kind of like, well, imagine you've got two ideas that seem to mean the exact same thing, but somehow they're not quite interchangeable. Like something about the way we think about them or how they're presented actually makes a difference, even if the logic is the same.
Yeah, that's the heart of it. You'd think if two things are logically equivalent, they'd always be swappable. But hyperintentionality kind of throws a wrench in that whole idea. It's this idea that the way we frame things, even if the underlying truth is the same, can really matter.
So basically, we're diving into this deep dive, ready to get all philosophical and question how we even distinguish between different ideas. Like, how finely can we slice and dice concepts, even when they seem to be basically two sides of the same coin?
Well, at its core, hyperintentionality is all about making distinctions between things that are what we call necessarily equivalent. Now, you might be wondering, what does that even mean?
Right. Break it down for us.
Okay, so think of possible worlds, right? Like all the different ways reality could have played out. If you've got two statements and they're both true in every single one of those possible worlds, then we say they're necessarily equivalent.
Okay. So give me an example.
Sure. How about all squares have four sides and no triangles have four sides? Those are true by definition, no matter what crazy universe you dream up.
Yeah, okay, I see. Those are always going to be true. They're like linked together.
Exactly. Now, to really get where hyperintentionality comes in, it helps to compare it to other ways we think about, well, sameness. But take simple negation, right? If the sky is blue is true and grass is green is true, then they're negations. The sky is not blue, grass is not green. Those are both false. Simple enough, right?
Yeah, it's all about whether the statement is true or false in the actual world.
Exactly. Only the truth value matters there. But what happens when we bring in something like necessity? You know, it is necessary that.
Now things are getting a bit more complicated, huh?
A little bit, but stick with me. So, with necessity, it's not enough for something to just be true in our world. It has to be true in all possible worlds to be necessarily equivalent. So, for instance, all bachelors are unmarried men. That's got to be true in every possible scenario.
By definition, yeah.
And let's say we've got some super complex mathematical theorem that's also got to be true in every possible world. Then both it is necessary that all bachelors are unmarried men, and it is necessary that this theorem is true, well, they both hold, because they're both necessarily true.
So necessary equivalence is like a stronger form of saneness than just having the same truth value in our world right now. It's about truth across all these weird hypothetical universes.
Precisely. But here's where things get really trippy. Hyperintentionality says even when two things are necessarily equivalent, meaning true in all the same possible worlds, sometimes you can't just swap them out in a sentence without messing things up. Like the way an idea is phrased, the specific wording, it actually seems to matter.
Okay, now you've got my attention. Let's talk about a real-world example. Imagine you're looking at a job prospect, right? And someone tells you, you have a 40% chance of succeeding. Now, logically, that's the same as saying you have a 60% chance of failing, right? Same odds, just flipped around.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are two necessarily equivalent ways to describe the same situation.
But studies have shown that people tend to feel way more optimistic, way more likely to actually go for it when they hear 40% chance of succeeding.
It's weird, isn't it? Even though the information is technically the same, something about that positive framing just hits us differently.
So our beliefs, in this case, about whether to pursue the job or not, seem to be sensitive to this whole hyper-intentional thing. Like, it's not just about the raw facts, but how they're presented to us, how we actually process them in our minds.
Yeah, that's a great example of how beliefs can be hyper-intentional. Here's another one. Consider the statements Mike is Mike versus Mike is Jack the Ripper.
Okay, Mike is Mike. That's got to be true no matter what. True in every single possible world, right?
Yep, about as basic as it gets.
Now, let's say, oh man, it turns out our neighbor Mike is actually Jack the Ripper. Philosophers call names like Mike rigid designators, meaning they always point to the same guy, no matter what possible world we're talking about. So if Mike is Jack the Ripper, then Mike is Jack the Ripper would also be true in every possible world where Mike exists.
Right, they'd be necessarily equivalent. Both true under the same set of conditions.
But come on, the information those two statements give you is completely different. Knowing Mike is Mike tells you absolutely nothing new, but Mike is Jack the Ripper, whoa, that changes everything.
Talk about a bombshell, right?
It's the difference between stating the obvious and having this huge revelation. And it's not just the information, it's also about how we know it. Mike is Mike. That's something you just know automatically, a priori, like 2 plus 2 equals 4. You don't need to go out and do any experiments to figure that out.
It's just true by definition.
But Mike is Jack the Ripper. Even if it turned out to be true, you'd need evidence, investigations, all that stuff. You wouldn't just know it instinctively, a priori.
So not only is the information they convey totally different, but the way we come to know them, whether it's a priori or not, is also different, even though they're necessarily equivalent under our assumptions. It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
It really is. And this hyperintentionality thing, it actually kind of shakes up how philosophers have traditionally thought about analyzing things.
Mm.
Our sources talk about this intentional revolution that happened in the late 20th century, where philosophers started using possible worlds to analyze stuff like belief, information, even the essence of what makes something what it is.
Yeah, and it was a big shift. Possible world semantics. It became like this dominant framework for analyzing all sorts of things, from logic to linguistics to even artificial intelligence. The idea was to understand these concepts by looking at which possible worlds they held true in.
But as we're seeing, many of these very things, belief, information, they seem to be hyper-intentional. They require a way of distinguishing things that's even more fine-grained than just looking at truth conditions across all possible worlds. It's like standard possible world semantics just lumps everything that's true in the same worlds together, and that's not enough to capture these subtle differences.
Right, and that's created some serious headaches for philosophers working in this area. They're starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, we need more powerful tools than just possible worlds to really understand these complex concepts.
So the million-dollar question here is, why should we care about this hyper-intentionality stuff? Why is it so important for us as, philosophers trying to figure out the world?
Well, it's forcing us to reconsider some of our most basic assumptions about meaning, truth, and how we represent the world around us. And maybe, just maybe, it'll even help us understand the world itself a little bit better. So our mission in this deep dive is to really explore why this seemingly obscure topic is actually a big deal and how philosophers are trying to grapple with these challenges.
Awesome. I'm ready to get into it.
All right, let's do it.
Okay, so we've spent a good chunk of time laying out this whole hyper-intentionality puzzle. Now, let's dig deeper into how this idea pops up in different areas of philosophy and see how people are trying to make sense of it all.
All right, sounds good. So we've seen that hyperintentionality isn't just some isolated philosophical quirk. It seems to have these far-reaching implications. It affects how we understand not just our own thoughts and words, but also, potentially, aspects of reality itself that exist independent of our minds.
Yeah, our sources kind of break it down into two categories. Representational concepts, those related to how we humans think and talk about the world, and then potentially non-representational ones, those aspects of reality that might exist regardless of us.
Right. So let's start with the representational stuff. We already touched on beliefs with the job prospect example and knowledge with Mike and Jack the Ripper. But another classic example that illustrates how our knowledge can be hyperintentional is this whole issue of logical omniscience.
Logical omniscience. Refresh my memory on that one.
Sure. Basically, it's this idea that if you know one thing, you should automatically know all its logical consequences. And you should also automatically know all logical truths.
That doesn't sound very realistic, does it?
Not at all. I mean, we've all been there struggling to follow some complex argument, even if it technically follows logically from stuff we already know. And let's be honest, none of us have perfect knowledge of every single logical truth.
Definitely not.
So standard possible worlds semantics really struggles with this. Because if two statements are necessarily equivalent, meaning they're true in all the same possible worlds, then logically speaking, knowing one means you should know the other. But our brains, well, they don't work that way. We have limited cognitive resources, and the way information is organized in our minds, it's just not that simple.
Right, we can't just instantly grasp every single logical implication of everything we know. It takes time, effort, and sometimes, well, a lot of head scratching.
Exactly. And it's not just about belief and knowledge. Information itself, the very concept of information, that seems to be hyperintentional too. Like take the statements, if Kennedy was shot, then Kennedy was shot, and then something like Fermat's last theorem. Both of them are necessarily true, right?
Yeah, I mean, the first one's kind of obvious. And Fermat's last theorem, well, mathematicians figured that one out, so it's got to be true.
Right. They both have to be true in every possible world. But the information those two statements carry, it's vastly different. The first one, it's a tautology. It doesn't really tell you anything new. But Fermat's last theorem, whoa, that's a powerful piece of mathematical knowledge that took centuries to prove.
Yeah, it really drives home the point that Information isn't just about whether something is true or not. It's also about, well, how surprising it is, how much it changes our understanding of things.
Exactly. And that leads us to meaning, the meaning of words and sentences are semantic concepts. The fact that if Kennedy was shot, then Kennedy was shot, and Fermat's last theorem, they both have the same truth conditions in standard semantics because they're both necessarily true, but clearly they don't mean the same thing. That suggests that meaning itself has this hyper-intentional dimension to it.
Absolutely. And our sources talk a lot about how this plays out in conditional statements, those if-then statements. The paradoxes that come up with material and strict conditionals, those partly stem from the fact that they don't capture the kind of intuitive connection we expect between the if part and the then part in everyday language. It's like there should be some sort of relevant link between them, not just this abstract truth-functional connection.
Right, and hyper-intentional approaches to conditionals try to give us a more nuanced understanding of that connection, how the two parts are related in terms of content and meaning, not just truth values.
Especially when it comes to counterfactuals, those what-if statements about things that didn't actually happen.
Yeah.
Like there's this example about whether sick children in South America would have cared if Hobbes had squared the circle.
That's a classic one.
Yeah, it highlights how the truth of those kinds of statements seems to depend on more than just whether the initial if part is possible or not. Like the actual content of the hypothetical scenario, even if it's impossible, seems to matter.
Right. It's not just about the possibility or impossibility of Hobbes squaring the circle, but about the relationship between that hypothetical event and what the sick children would have cared about. It gets into these deep questions about how we evaluate the truth of counterfactuals.
Okay, so we've seen how hyperintentionality affects how we think and talk about the world, but what about the world itself? Our sources also discuss the idea that even reality, independent of our minds, might exhibit hyperintentional features.
That's where things get really meta, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And philosophers like Kit Fine, they've argued that the very essence of things, what makes something fundamentally what it is, that's hyperintentional too.
Like the example they use is Socrates. Socrates is essentially human, but he's not essentially human and a member of a set, even though necessarily every human is also a member of a set.
Right. It's like being human is a core defining feature of Socrates, but being part of a set, that's more of an accidental feature. It doesn't really get at his fundamental nature.
Exactly. It's about what truly defines something. Like the real definition of the number 2 is that it's the successor of 1, not that it's 10 minus 8. Even though those descriptions pick out the same number, the first one captures its essential nature, its place in the number system.
I see. So essence is about more than just necessarily referring to the same thing. It's about a deeper level of identity, what makes something truly what it is.
And this idea, it extends to other fundamental concepts too, like grounding, the idea that some facts are more basic and explain other facts. For example, the fact that a particular set exists, that might be grounded in the fact that its individual members exist, but it's not the other way around. The existence of the members is more fundamental.
Yeah, it's like a one-way street. The existence of the set depends on the members, but not the other way around. So even though they're necessarily linked, there's this asymmetry in terms of what explains what.
Exactly. And that asymmetry, that direction of explanation, that seems to be a hyperintentional feature. It's not captured by just looking at necessary equivalence.
And then there's this distinction between properties that are intrinsic to an object and those that depend on its relationship to other things. That also seems to have this hyperintentional flavor to it.
Right. Like, is a property inherent to the object itself, or does it depend on the object's connections to other stuff? That's not always captured by just looking at whether that property necessarily goes hand in hand with some other property.
Our sources give this great example, being an instance of Barack's actual favorite property versus having a mass. Even if it turns out that mass is, in fact, Barack's favorite property, and so anything that has mass is also an instance of Barack's favorite property, intuitively, those two properties feel really different.
Yeah, like having mass feels like a fundamental feature of an object, something inherent to it. But being Barack's favorite property, that seems more external. It depends on this whole other thing, Barack's preferences.
So even though they might necessarily go together, there's something deeper about the nature of those properties that distinguishes them.
Right. And it doesn't stop there.
Yeah.
Even dispositions, what something is inclined to do under certain circumstances, those might be hyper-intentional too. Like, take Heidi, the mathematician, right? Heidi is disposed to find a mathematical proof if one exists.
Okay, makes sense. She's a good mathematician.
But even if it turns out that a proof for a particular statement is impossible, we can't just swap in any other impossible condition and say that Heidi is now disposed to find a proof for that. The specific content of the impossible situation, it actually seems to matter.
It's like Heidi's disposition is specifically tied to the possibility of a proof existing, not just to the general idea of something being impossible.
Right. And our sources, they also touch on probabilities, obligations, truth makers, what makes a statement true, even the absence of impossible outcomes. It's like the more we look, the more we see these hints of hyperintentionality popping up all over the place. It really suggests that maybe we need to rethink some of our fundamental assumptions about equivalence, about what it means for things to be the same.
Yeah, it's a lot to wrap your head around. But it's also incredibly fascinating. It's like this whole new way of looking at the world and at how we think about it. Now, of course, not everyone's on board of this whole hyperintentionality train. There are philosophers who try to, explain away these apparent distinctions, arguing that our good old-fashioned ways of thinking about meaning and truth are still sufficient.
Right. They're not convinced that we need this whole new level of complexity.
And one of the big challenges they bring up is this thing called the Boolean challenge. Basically, they're asking, can you even build a logical system for hyperintentional expressions that still plays nice with basic logical operations like not and? Like, if we allow for all these different but necessarily equivalent propositions, won't standard logic just collapse them all back into being the same thing?
That's one of the big worries, yeah, is like, how do you maintain these fine-grained distinctions without breaking logic as we know it?
And then there are those who really want to defend the standard possible worlds framework, like Solnaker and Lewis. They're trying to come up with ways to explain away our intuitions about hyperintentionality without giving up on their basic approach.
Yeah, they try to argue that, look, maybe it just seems like there are these hyperintentional distinctions, but really it's more about how we use language or maybe a lack of understanding the true meaning of the terms involved.
Like Stolnaker, he suggests that when we fail to recognize that two necessarily equivalent statements are actually saying the same thing, it's because we haven't fully grasped the meaning of those sentences.
Yeah, like we're kind of missing something about the underlying concepts.
But, as our sources point out, that explanation doesn't always hold water. Like, think about a mathematician grappling with Goldbach's conjecture, that famous unsolved problem. They clearly understand what the conjecture means, but they don't know if it's true or false, let alone necessarily true or false. So it's not just about a lack of understanding the meaning of the terms involved. There's something else going on.
Right. Sometimes we can fully understand the meaning of something and still not know its truth value. And Lewis, he offers a different strategy, what he calls the fragmentation strategy. He suggests that maybe our beliefs aren't all neatly organized in one big, consistent system. Maybe they're kind of compartmentalized into different frames of mind.
So it's like we can hold seemingly contradictory beliefs without actually believing everything in its opposite.
Exactly. And that could explain why we sometimes don't make the logical connections between different beliefs. It's like they're living in different mental compartments.
Interesting idea. But even Lewis's approach has its limits, right?
Yeah, it doesn't fully explain why we don't just instantly grasp all the logical consequences of our beliefs, even relatively simple ones. It's like even within a single frame of mind, there are still these hyperintentional distinctions that matter.
So while there have been valiant efforts to, resist this whole hyperintentionality thing, it seems like they often run into some pretty big obstacles. It's like the philosophical need to make these finer distinctions, it's not going away that easily.
Which leads us to another big question. If we accept that hyperintentionality is real, how fine-grained do we need to make these distinctions? How finely do we need to slice and dice these concepts?
That's the so-called granularity problem, right?
Exactly. And it seems like there's no easy answer. Different hyperintentional phenomena might require different levels of granularity. Some distinctions might be super subtle, while others are more significant. And our sources even suggest that these hyperintentional distinctions might not be, neatly ordered.
What do you mean by that?
Well, one way of looking at things might distinguish between two necessarily equivalent statements, while another approach might not, and vice versa for a different pair of statements. It's like there might not be this one perfect way to carve up the space of meaning.
That sounds pretty messy.
A little bit, yeah. It's complicated stuff. But, philosophy wouldn't be philosophy if it wasn't a little messy.
That's for sure. But thankfully, Philosophers are coming up with some pretty creative ways to tackle this whole hyperintentionality problem.
Hmm.
Our sources outline a bunch of different approaches, and they're all pretty fascinating.
Yeah, let's dive into some of those.
All right, so one of the prominent approaches is two-dimensional semantics. Now, this builds on the whole possible worlds idea, but adds an extra layer, something called character, alongside content.
Think of character as a kind of instruction manual that tells you how the content of an expression might change depending on the context.
Okay, I'm starting to see how that could be useful. Like,
Yeah.
take words like I or here, right?
Yeah.
What those words refer to changes depending on who's speaking and where they are.
Exactly. And philosophers have tried to extend this idea of character to capture some of those hyperintentional distinctions we see with proper names and natural kind terms, especially when we're talking about beliefs. It's a way to account for how the meaning of those terms might shift subtly depending on the context of the belief.
Cool. So what else is on the table?
Another strategy focuses on the idea of aboutness or subject matter. Basically, it says that the meaning of a statement isn't just about which possible worlds it's true in, but also what the statement is about. Two statements can be necessarily equivalent, meaning they're true in all the same possible worlds, but they could be about totally different things, and that's what makes their meanings different.
I think I get that. So like a statement like either there's an even number of stars or there isn't. That's got to be true in every possible world, right?
Yep, no matter what, one of those has to be true.
But it's a pretty bland statement. It's not really about anything specific. Now, compare that to something like there are no non-self-identical Italian restaurants. That's also necessarily true because everything is identical to itself. But it's talking about Italian restaurants. It has a specific subject matter.
Exactly. And that difference in subject matter, that's what this approach tries to capture.
Okay, so we've got two-dimensional semantics. We've got aboutness. What other tools are in the hyperintentional toolbox?
Well, there's this thing called extended world semantics, which gets pretty wild. It's like, okay, we've got possible worlds, all the ways things could have been, but what about impossible worlds?
Impossible worlds, like worlds where the laws of logic don't even apply.
Yep, that's the idea. Worlds where contradictions are true, where maybe even 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 4. It's like expanding the realm of possibility to include the impossible. And by incorporating these impossible worlds into our semantics, we can actually distinguish between different statements that are necessarily false or necessarily true.
Whoa, so like instead of just saying this statement is necessarily false, we can say this statement is false in these specific impossible worlds, but true in these other impossible worlds.
Exactly. It opens up all these new ways to think about counterfactuals that involve impossible scenarios and other tricky cases where just looking at possible worlds doesn't seem to cut it.
Pretty mind-bending stuff.
Oh, yeah. And then we've got relevance logic, which takes a different approach. It focuses on the connection between the if part and the then part of a conditional statement. Remember those paradoxes we talked about with material and strict conditionals? Well, relevance logic tries to avoid those by saying, look, there's got to be a relevant link in terms of content between the antecedent and the consequent. You can't just stick any old if and then together and call it a day.
So it's like the if part has to actually be relevant to the then part, not just in terms of truth values, but in terms of meaning and content.
Exactly. And this approach, it's particularly good at handling conditional statements where the premise might be logically impossible or the conclusion might be necessarily true without making the whole statement automatically true in this trivial way. It preserves the intuition that there should be a meaningful connection between the two parts.
Gotcha. So that's relevance logic. What else you got?
All right, next up we have structured propositions. Now, this is where things get a bit more technical. Instead of thinking of propositions as just sets of possible worlds, structured propositions say, no, 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 propositions are more complex than that. They're built up from the meanings of the individual words and phrases in the sentence.
Okay, so it's like the structure of the sentence, how the words are arranged, actually matters for the meaning of the proposition.
Precisely. So a sentence like Robin loves Batman, that's going to be a different proposition than Batman loves Robin, even though they might both be true in the same possible worlds. The components are arranged differently, so they express different propositions.
I see. So it's like we're adding this extra layer of detail, looking at the internal structure of propositions, not just the sets of worlds where they're true.
And that extra layer of detail, that's what allows us to make those hyperintentional distinctions. And finally, we have algebraic and object theory approaches, which often treat meanings as these fundamental building blocks and focus on the relationships between them. These frameworks can be super flexible in making hyperintentional distinctions because they're not tied down to truth conditions and possible worlds as the be-all and end-all of meaning.
It's amazing to see how many different angles philosophers are coming at this problem from.
Yeah, and it really highlights the creativity and ingenuity that goes into philosophical work.
Absolutely. So it seems like no single approach has all the answers yet, right? It's still very much a work in progress.
Oh, yeah. The hyperintentional revolution is still in full swing. The granularity problem, how fine-grained these distinctions need to be, that's still a big challenge. And we've seen how philosophers are developing all sorts of solutions from two-dimensional semantics and aboutness to extended worlds, relevance logic, structured propositions, algebraic theories. It's a whole smorgasbord of ideas.
It's a great reminder that philosophy is all about pushing the boundaries, about questioning our assumptions, even about something as seemingly basic as what it means for two things to be the same.
And as we wrap up our deep dive into hyperintentionality, it's clear that the simple notion of equivalence, well, it's a lot more complicated than it first appears. We've seen how it touches on how we think and talk about the world, and potentially even on the world itself.
And while there's still debate about whether we truly need to embrace this whole hyperintentionality thing and whether our existing philosophical tools can handle it, the fact that people are developing all these new theories and frameworks, that shows just how important it is to a lot of philosophers.
It's forcing us to rethink some of our most basic assumptions about meaning, truth, and logic.
And that brings us to a final thought for you, our listener. As you go about your day, think about all the times you rely on distinctions that go beyond simple logical equivalence. Are there areas in your own life, in your work, where the way something is presented or conceived, even if logically the same, actually makes a difference? This deep dive into hyperintentionality, hopefully, it's giving you a new lens to examine the world and all its subtle complexities.
It's definitely given me a lot to think about.
Me too. Until next time, keep on pondering.